this was sort of nuts, and it started to travel around on Twitter and social media. I mean, I'm not terribly surprised by any of this. I mean, CNBC is specifically for, aged, wealthy oligarchy type.
An aspiring oligarch.
Aspiring. And but it's there's sometimes where it's just like the veneer gets completely ripped off, and they are literally just some type of tool of the elite to beat up anybody who in any way steps on their narrative. And in this one, it's particularly interesting because the heiress to the Disney fortune, and I don't know if she has any job in Disney. I think she just, I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
Heiress.
Well, she's the heiress to the Disney fortune, and that's the way that they identify her. Abigail Disney.
It says on Wikipedia, she's a documentary filmmaker, philanthropist, and activist known for her documentary films focused on social themes.
Yeah, okay, so she's an heiress.
Yeah, she's an heiress. Well, I mean, you can be an heiress and also be running the company. In this instance, she's just, an heiress, and I would imagine also it's not just she's already gotten a significant portion of that wealth. And she is, I'm not sure what organization she's with or how she ended up in this situation, but she's on CNBC arguing for wholesale changes in the structure of our tax code across the board. And here she is getting really browbeaten, I guess, is really the best word, by Andrew Ross Sorkin, Bertha Coombs, and Joe Kernan, who I think on some level there's a certain amount of resentment that they are exhibiting that they wouldn't. It's very difficult because these people worship wealth, right? And implicit in their worship of wealth is this sense that if you are wealthy, regardless of how you got there, there is some moral superiority that is associated with it.
She knows better than them.
And yes. So like when Alex Perrine, let's say, goes on CNBC, they will talk to him with the same with a different type of drippy condescension than they can with a Disney heiress. With a Disney heiress, it's just sort of more anger than condescension. And so it's fascinating. We could have played the entire, 10-minute clip, but we're going to end up playing about, I think, 4 or 5 minutes of it. But here is where they are now shifting. It's like they're trying to find where they're going to penetrate this force field. And now it's that she doesn't know what patriotism really is about.
If someone amasses a lot of money and then leaves it to charity, are they unpatriotic?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, they're not paying taxes.
No, of course not, but we have all agreed as a country, we have laws that favor charitable contributions.
Then by definition, it's not necessarily patriotic to pay higher taxes.
Pause it. Do you understand that formulation there is like somebody who took logic class and completely did not quite get it? Like he thinks he's doing like one of those theorems, right? Like if A is to B,
it's a syllogism.
Let me tell you, I remember.
But he's getting it wrong.
I remember taking logic or Greek philosophy in college, and I shouldn't say this publicly, but it was not an easy subject. And he was not only a person who took the class, he was the guy when you're in finals and no one has any sleep and you're like, all right, we just got to meet and have a study group and figure this out before the test. And he ruins the whole study group because not only does you don't know enough to kill the test, but you know enough that he's totally wrong, but he won't shut up.
He's convinced that he's right and he's wrong here. But here he is with this clever calculation. So you're not unpatriotic to give to to charity.
I
Well,
rest my case.
Therefore, you are patriotic to have that money. Go ahead.
It's not necessarily patriotic to pay higher taxes.
No, of course it's not, unless the tax rates are unfair. The problem is that there's a systematic favoring of people who have accumulated an enormous amount of wealth. The problem isn't
Maybe
that
it's an estate
individual
tax.
people should be paying more.
Maybe it's an estate tax issue then, because the people
it's partly an estate tax
people that
issue,
accrue
yes.
wealth in their own lifetime do
Yes.
it out of hard work and paying ordinary income. Then they're able to own assets, which are then taxed differently.
Many of them do, but many of the people in the Forbes 400 inherited money and started on third base.
What would you do to the estate tax?
Well, with the estate tax, I would certainly, you have to raise the exemption a little bit, and you have to index it.
So the current exemption is $11.2 million.
Right. I think where it is right now, I think it's good. And that whole mythology about how the family farm gets broken up and everybody is sad, it affects maybe 4 or 5 families in any given year. So that narrative needs to be eliminated. What happens if you lower the estate tax, or you reduce, as many people say, the estate tax, you get a concentration of wealth in families, and already we have an
Pause it for
education
1 second.
system that
Now, Kernan went to the estate tax, right, as a dig on her. Like, his whole thing about, like, people earn, they start with nothing in some cases, and then they make all this money, and then they invest in assets, and that's why the income from those assets is treated differently, because theoretically the money that they saved the first time in their wage job was what provided them with the money for these assets. Well, first off, we know, because of the complete reduction in mobility, that more often than not, that's not the case. That it all derived from, like, he was a waiter and he saved all his money, and then he invested in an apartment, and he flipped that and then turned it into a huge building. That story does happen. But here's the other point. Who cares? Who cares? Because the context in which someone can even place that bet, assuming that every single person who owns $1 billion or hundreds of millions of dollars did it because they worked as a waiter or a janitor, and they saved up their pennies, and they placed a bet on something that worked out. The context in which that bet happens and pays off is a function of society allowing for that to happen, right? Because there are plenty of societies out there where you can't just place a bet and get lucky and flip it and make all this money. You need to pay off different corrupt entities, or you need to provide, services for specific areas. I mean, this doesn't occur in nature. The
100%.
idea that you can make these bets, that in nature you could bet this money that you made as a janitor and it would inflate.
You
So
never
this all
observed that
is
at
a
the
function
Bronx Zoo?
of society.
They do that?
Continue.
And already we have an education system that favors the wealthy. We have a segregated population of wealthy people who are further segregating themselves by living in gated communities and so forth. We are creating a two-tiered society, which we should fear.
What do you make of the argument that that we're in a much more mobile world than ever before? That if you look at what happened in Connecticut, for example, and people have been fleeing Connecticut, obviously, for other states in the United States, but if you actually raise the federal taxes in a remarkably meaningful way, to the sort of 70% kinds of numbers you get bandied about,
not me.
people would be on airplanes moving to other countries.
Yeah. My feeling about that is the ones who leave because the tax rates go up here are welcome to leave. Frankly, we don't want them here, because what they don't want to participate in is a society that is structured around fairness.
Democracy.
We do not have a society structured around fairness right now, and the proof is in the pudding. Look at the lives of working class people in America. I talk to workers at Disneyland who can't afford their insulin because they're working at minimum wage. This is unacceptable, and I can't sit back and accumulate wealth because I simply, A, inherited it, and B, have the good sense to simply own it.
But Abigail, it sounds like
at
this
the
is a pretty
expense of
broad,
people.
You're talking about a lot of different things.
I'm talking about a lot of different things.
Minimum wage being raised, whether
Right.
estate taxes, the exemption get brought down, whether the basic wages or basic tax rates go up, and then also just taking a look at capital gains. That's,
Of course, and so it's hard
Pause
not
it for 1 second. All right, there's two things. One is, let's work backwards. she's talking about a broad base of things, but every single one of those issues are completely implicated by the wealth inequality we have in this country. Every single one of those issues are a function of what happens when you go from a plutonomy to a plutocracy, where you have a concentration of wealth that then begins to concentrate political power. So every one of those issues are implicated by everything she's saying. And the other thing I would add is the idea that this is about fairness is too narrow of a construct, because the fact of the matter is it's completely about the stability of our society. Yes, it may be the case that it's unfair, but you don't need to show that it's unfair to say that we cannot continue in this way, that it's anti-democratic, it is destabilizing. All those people that Andrew Ross Sorkin knows who are going to get on their plane and going to leave this country because they don't like the federal tax rates, not only is it a question of fairness, well, fine, we don't want people like that. The absence of their ability to impact the political structure in this country, right? Because they're foreigners now and they're subject to a different set of laws, theoretically anyways, in terms of how they influence our politics. And they also, you want to leave the United States and renounce your citizenship to avoid taxes? Great. You can't invest here. You got to keep all of your cash outside of this country. Good luck. You're going to understand the value, or your heirs will understand the value of the benefits that you had in this country.
That are designed for that, right? Like Singapore is pretty much designed that way. The Emirates are designed that way. And look, if you have citizenship and you have certain access, that's an incredibly nice lifestyle. Those are also undemocratic places that are built in some cases on like literal indentured servitude. So not only is
and
it
the prices in the housing, incidentally, in Connecticut, they're going to flatten a little bit.
They're going to
because
flatten
all
a
these
little bit.
people.
And also just that, that too, though, a deeper point would be to say to these people, like, do you want America to be Singapore? I mean, okay, but then you shouldn't keep talking about like apple pie and elections and freedom, because that's not what's going on here. I mean,
Some people do.
Singapore is in some ways for what it is, it's a super successful place, but people should be transparent about what it is.
And then they start getting really sort of pissy about it. Joe Kernan in particular, he is really mad. He is really mad.
He was so mad that he actually even brought up the estate tax. And that's a really funny thing about this segment, is that they actually start splitting their own talking points.
Yes.
And then the other question I was going to ask you is, there's a Disney shareholder meeting today, as it happens.
Yes.
And Bob Iger's pay has been reduced by about $13.5 million, I believe. How much of this is about taxes in your mind? Or do you say to yourself, you know what, maybe corporate America is being paid too much? How do you balance those issues?
Well, I do believe, as I say, it's hard to separate these things out because they've been woven together in a system that, is systematically favors
Do you think
wealthy.
that Bob Iger's overpaid?
I think that
know
CEOs in general are
I imagine
paid
you have a lot of Disney
far too
stock,
much.
right?
I'm not going to come out and say that. But I will say that if your CEO salary is at the 700, 600, 500 times your median workers paid, then there is nobody on earth. Jesus Christ himself isn't worth 500 times his median workers.
What would Walt Disney think of this pay?
I really have no idea.
I've never heard a good answer to this, but why don't you just voluntarily write a check? You're worth $500 million.
Oh, there's a good answer to that.
What is it?
It is ridiculous to say that, in fact.
Okay, that's your answer? It's ridiculous?
No, it's not my answer.
You're free to write the check,
that
though, right?
The problems are structural. My measly few $100 million will do nothing to address
neither will the 400. Neither will the 400.
Schools, hospitals.
Neither will taxing the 400 richest families. Is a drop in the bucket, too.
The tax structure so that our 50% of Americans are not living at negative debt.
Or paying taxes.
They're paying taxes. They will be paying
not income taxes. Not income taxes.
Payroll, everything
Joe
else.
Kernan, this guy. But first off, let me just say this. If you get your pay cut by $13 million and you're still doing okay, you're being paid too much. Like if $13 million is not debilitating to you to be cut that way, like if that doesn't throw you into debt, that you to be able to get your pay cut that way, there's a real problem. And the thing that Joe Kernan either doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand is that the reason why you tax those 400, billionaires or whatever that class of people is in this country is not exclusively to raise money to spend. It is to keep them from having that money. It's not about fairness. It is about stability of society. It is about having a society that can function and is fair and is serving the function of why we organize into society. So it doesn't matter what an individual does, whether they can raise as much money, whether it's one person who has as much as the other 399 or not. The bottom line is that you need a policy to address the instability that's being created in our society. And the way you do that is not by one person deciding one-off, I'm going to donate. And he knows this. It's just him being pissy.
I also want to apologize if Abigail Disney is watching this clip, because I feel like she might be. But I can't help but say that if Walt Disney were around today, he might say something like, when did my granddaughter start hanging out with so many Jews? Getting these goddamn socialist notions.
Yeah, she's a good class trader. I mean, it's about democracy too, right? Because money is power in our society. Therefore, if you don't want one class of people to have an inordinate amount of influence, you should take away some of their power by taking away some of their money. I mean, obviously, I don't think it goes far enough, but it's certainly better than the alternative.
Isn't that, though, also with Schmidt when he had his little hissy fit on his podcast about doing the whole Howard Schultz scam? He kept saying this phrase. That's his word, is confiscatory. And that's really going to be their new frame, actually, amazingly enough. It is to flip the notion of who's in an exploited relationship. Because as what's her name who wrote Democracy in Chains, which is still like one of my favorite. Nancy MacLean, which read that book.
It's rich people identity politics.
It's not only is it rich people identity politics, she points out some of these original libertarian crackpots basically just, they tell the Marxist story. They just invert the working class or just the labor class period, the functionality, and then they just flip it to the capital class, that the capital class is endlessly exploited by everybody else by sucking their resources. So it's a very...
So let's abolish class society then.
I don't think that's the direction they take it in. But I think that you'll hear that, amazingly, you will hear a lot more appeals to fairness and what's right. And what's interesting, in addition to how ridiculous it is, it clearly is the emotional truth of, like, this is why Howard Schultz is having this prolonged national tantrum, is he's like personally aggrieved and offended that he might actually have to contribute something.
Yes. And the problem that they're having is that 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Frank Luntz could get out there and call it the death tax instead of the estate tax, and make it about, and then they would go to like sort of the second, the second redoubt, I guess, which was, this is about family farms. We don't want to destroy family farms. And Abigail Disney misstated. There's not 4 or 5 farms. They have trouble finding one in the history of the estate tax, a family farm that had to go under into this scenario. And that's one of the problems they have, is the flow of information, and things like social media makes it that much harder to sell these type of memes. And so, and I think they're going to have, they're moving to, like, the 3rd or 4th retreat when they start going like, it's really unfair to me, to lose my $13 million. Like, at one point, they're going to realize, like, that doesn't sound so good to people who are not normal CNBC.
Right. That doesn't sound to people who are either work for a living and or are sane. It's funny, this whole, like, family farm image, because last week on Majority Report, I had on the great Milton Alamati, and we were talking about, among other things, the South African elections and the need for land reform there. And I did, with, mindful that this is like an alt-right meme, I said, when you talk about land reform, you're not talking about literally like a small Afrikaner family farm. And he goes, of course not. In fact, there might be more room for them to have a little bit more property when we reclaim democratically, like, massive, like, expanses of basically white corporate farmland that has been stolen from people. It's never about the family farmer, should be like a hashtag. It's an awkward one, but it's true.